Hi there. My name is John Solomon, and welcome to the latest in the Cybersecurity Advisors Network's series of Secure in Mind videos and podcasts, where we have as guests people involved in the industry around the world with something interesting and useful and relevant to say in some form or another. This is a series of very informal and friendly conversations with stakeholders, academics, business leaders, scientists, engineers, what have you. And in that vein, today, I'd like to welcome Jillian Kwong. Jillian Kwong has a PhD from the University of Southern California and is currently a research scientist at MIT, specifically at the, I believe it's called the Institute for Cybersecurity at MIT Sloan, or CAMS. That does a series of excellent calls, weekly calls on various cybersecurity topics. And Jillian, I'm very, very glad that she's here because she's also one of the first members of the CyAN membership program pilot intake. And it's great to have you. So why don't you maybe introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, what your interests are, and then we can get talking a little bit about your research and your interests.
Hi, John. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. So as you mentioned, my background, I went to the University of Southern California for my PhD. I graduated from the Annenberg School of Communication. So one of the things is that's somewhat unique I've found in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of my approach. So my background is in communication. My dissertation looked at data privacy and how small and medium-sized enterprises were implementing GDPR and different data privacy legislation. And so that really looked at the human side, the process and managerial side of that. Similar here at CAMS, I look at a lot of the same issues, but in the context of cybersecurity. So I don't really do technical. One of the things that I really focus on are people and processes, and what is going well and what also still needs to be done in terms of those areas to really help improve cybersecurity and the deployment and the practice of it, as well as the study. So, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And I'd like to get back to the topic of, I think you described this to me before as your qualitative approach to cybersecurity. I think that's a very, very interesting view of the industry and the subject, especially given the increasing drive towards metrics and quantification among a lot of management levels. What I'd first like to jump on is your work in supply chain risk management. I think that's the kind of the focal area that you're involved in when we first began talking. It's also something very, very near and dear to me because I'm primarily a risk manager, and I believe it's kind of with the driving force behind a lot of what information security and cybersecurity more specifically is doing these days. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about your focus in that area, your methodology, maybe even some of your conclusions, and if we are allowed to, then I'll put some pointers to your published work in the video and podcast description afterwards.
Definitely. So yes, so like you mentioned, my area here is supply chain risk management. Primarily what I look at is small and medium-sized businesses within the supply chain. And so as we know, cybersecurity, especially supply chain, is important for large businesses of all sizes. One of the things is that your large corporations have the budget and the resources to dedicate to cybersecurity, shoring up their different vulnerabilities and things like that. But one area that particularly struggles with this is small and medium-sized businesses. They tend to have less expertise, less resources, and less ability to meet those challenges that large corporations do. However, one of the reasons why I find it so interesting is because they are still part of the supply chain. And so even if all of the big companies they themselves are very secure, if their supply chain is not, then those will leave open opportunities for attack or or for different things to happen. So that's one of the reasons why I really gravitated towards this area. I saw it as a huge challenge that really that needed attention that wasn't getting the attention that it needed. And so in terms of how I do that, I think that, like you mentioned, I do use a qualitative approach. Quantitative approaches, I think, are great, and there is so much being done on that side. And so what I like to see myself doing is qualitative that complements a lot of that quantitative. So a lot of my methodology relies on things like interviews, case studies, focus groups, participant observation to kind of really understand the day-to-day challenges that these small and medium-sized businesses are encountering. So, for example, one of the biggest things that they say is, okay, for small and medium-sized, they have to really keep their software up to date. And it's like, well, if they're not, then that's just a bad business decision. But when you actually go and talk to these managers and you say, okay, well, why is patching not higher up on the things that you're doing? And so, when you actually talk to them, they're saying, well, but, it's all part of an ecosystem. If we update one thing, a lot of times different things will break. So if we update Java, well, a lot of our other operating systems they're not on that same operating system. They're going to break and we're not able to continue working. So a lot of times when you start digging down into these issues, you realize that there's a lot more complexity that isn't just their they didn't want to, or it's just a lack of interest. There's actually a lot more behind those. So that's kind of what I find really, really interesting is the puzzles and how to figure out what is the problem that we're working with and then develop different ways to try to study and address those.
I think I've just been taking notes while you're talking, and there's about 3 or 4 distinct topics there that I think we could dive into, because I think these are all extremely relevant and timely right now. I think it's great that you're focusing on the SME side of things, because as far back as 2014 in the EU Network and Information Systems Directive, that was a major focus. And we've seen also in the US from both the White House and CISA and Homeland Security, a lot of focus paid to how to improve capabilities for SMEs. And one of the issues that keeps coming up, especially in light of the growth of these large monolithic reference risk management implementations and frameworks like NIST, like ISO 27000X, is there's all the resources out there for SMEs. There's tons of how SMEs can improve their security posture, especially in light of them not having a lot of resources. At the same time, though, it takes a lot of maturity and resource to even understand that you have that gap, and then to go out and actually find these resources that are designed specifically to help you. In light of your research, how do you have any views on how you're not only your typical individual SME, I realize it's a vast generalization, but also how authorities, the people, or even industry, the people best placed to help, augment the capabilities and preparedness and resilience of this big part of the economy, can help these smaller players just come to grasp with the sheer volume of stuff out there.
Right. So that's a really, really good point. One of the things that I say with this work, you mentioned that all the different resources are out there, and that is something that there has been a ton of work to create that content and put it out there, especially for free. And that's been a really big step. I think one of the things that you hit on perfectly is the way that I always talk about it is companies, there is no shortage of what they need to do, but it's how they do that. And that's really, so in terms of what they need to do, there's, like you mentioned, so many different guides. There's a lot of different frameworks to really help. However, it's the how do you actually implement in practice. And so one of the things that I've found in the research, so especially in terms of cybersecurity legislation. One of the things that you see is that small and medium-sized businesses, even though they are not directly impacted by a lot of these frameworks, if they are part of a supply chain and they're working with the big company or a conglomerate, if that major company is, a lot of times it will trickle down. So they might not be directly, but indirectly speaking, they're going to have to comply with a lot of these frameworks. One of the things that makes it really difficult is that these frameworks, when they were written, were mainly targeted for larger companies. And so they have a certain level of resources and ability to number one, interpret, understand, and then implement these. So they can interpret, what does this legislation mean, understand how it applies to them specifically, which are two different things, and then implement that in place. And so with these small and medium-sized businesses, you have two challenges. Number one, they don't have the expertise to necessarily understand what are these frameworks or what are these guidelines saying exactly? Like, what does that mean? Number one. Number two is, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my company? Because to understand what does that mean, you have to have a certain understanding of what your setup is. What is your infrastructure, and how are you actually doing things? And that's a second big pillar. And the third is, how does that legislation apply to my company, and what resources and what capabilities and limitations do I have that will allow certain things to be put in place, and what are certain things that are just outside of the scope of what we can do. And so that's one of those things that we found to be really challenging in terms of existing resources. So it's that there are resources out there, but it's the how to get there. And it is one of those issues that I don't think, there's a perfect solution. I've talked to experts where there is this, you have to find that middle ground. There's all the resources out there telling people, okay, go find the resources, which is great. It scales very well, right? But in order to implement it, that takes a lot more work, does need more hands on deck to do that, and involvement and investment. But you can't really consult each one individually. That doesn't scale very well. It works very, very well on a one-on-one basis and to some extent, but if you want to scale it, it's very difficult. So that's one of the things that I think everybody's trying to figure out, is how do we kind of find that middle ground where, we can reach a large number of companies, get them where they need to be, but, make it feasible in terms of, the resources and resource limitations that exist out there.
And I mean, honestly, just a personal opinion, I find it a little bit rich that even when large Fortune 500, FTSE 100 corporations cannot always successfully manage their own IT estate, that we're asking, smaller, very small firms that maybe they manufacture electric controllers for patio sunshade motors or something like that, to fill these same requirements. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at, for example, the EU's NIS2 directive, it specifies, I believe it's something like 29 critical sectors. And I took a closer look at the appendix that describes which industries are affected by this regulation. And there is a specific bit in there that says that, essentially, while we address the bigger ones, because the bigger ones are more critical, right? They can break more things if they break. There are many circumstances when we do not distinguish or differentiate based on size. So the smaller ones are also covered. So this opens up this incredibly interesting can of worms, which, like you were saying, a lot of these companies, they have this, they just don't know how to get at this information, these capabilities, especially when they're part of a large firm supply chain, and all of a sudden they're getting these massive questionnaires. Now, what I've seen, and full disclosure, I only know one of these companies and I have an investment in them. So they're called Vendict. They do, blatant plug there. They do actually filling out exactly these kinds of supplier questionnaires using AI technology. I know AI is a bit of a buzzword right now. Do you think that approach automating these kinds of compliance mechanisms could go some way towards the hows of helping these smaller firms master this flood of expectations of them?
So that's a really interesting point. I'm not sure. I'll be honest on that one. I think one of the things that, regardless of whatever solution that is put forth, I think one of the main things to really think about, and which is where this qualitative approach comes in, is, are we actually addressing the problem that we need to? Or are we just speeding up the processes in place, the current processes in place? So those are questions that I'm always trying to think about in whatever, different avenues that we're talking about and thinking about.
Can I stop you there for a second? Can you expand a bit on that? What you mean by speeding up the processes?
Right. And so one of the things that we tend to see, and so like you mentioned, there's a lot of these questionnaires, they tend to be very lengthy, very large. And so, that's just a very cumbersome thing for many, many reasons. Like we've talked before, it is, there's a lot of limitations or shortcomings in that approach. And so one of the main ways that people have looked to combat that is to shorten the questionnaires and to make them shorter, which is, yes, that in some ways that addresses the problem to make them less cumbersome, right? But in my mind, when I think about it, I'm like, okay, yes, that addresses one aspect of the problem. But for me, when I think about it from a research standpoint, were these questionnaires actually doing, like, initially speaking to the original part of it, was that actually what people wanted? Was it doing the job that people hoped or set out that these questionnaires set out to do? Or are we just kind of addressing, or is it more putting a Band-Aid on the problem?
So it's kind of a box ticking exercise.
Kind of, and just like, are we actually getting at the root of the problem, or are we just kind of treating the symptoms of it? And that is what I would say for any sort of solution that we think about in this area, and to really say what's a major problem or issue that we were set out to address, and how does that address it? And so it might address certain aspects or different things, but really kind of always keeping that in focus, because one of the things that qualitative allows us to do is to really allows us to really find a problem and dig in and to see it from different ways and different levels. And so what I really enjoy about the qualitative is the ability to study humans and the variability that comes. So one of the things that's great about quantitative, it does measurements. It is very exact. It is repeatable. It is generalizable. But one of the things about humans is that they are notorious for being very difficult to study. Why? Even the same person will not always be exactly the same. You and me if we say on a Tuesday night, or what are we doing? That, even though sometimes probably it's very similar, there's still a lot of generalizability. Our actions will change, and for many different reasons, but even the same person is not going to be exactly the same all the time. So that's one of the big challenges of studying humans, and qualitative allows us to do that. Why? Because it allows us to really look at a situation and understand all the different factors at play. We don't necessarily boil it down to the exact variables and the different weights of each variable, but we can understand the larger forces at play in a situation and that helps us understand the different decision making. It helps us learn about what are the different forces and how to understand it and understand what happened, but also see new paths forward. And so that's where I see qualitative as a really useful methodology for this area, and for cybersecurity in general.
You kind of touched on a recurring pet peeve of mine, which is don't get me started ranting on this, that management, or good management, is difficult because because as you imply, you have to deal with difficult people, with people who have different levels of capabilities, depending on whether it's a Whiskey Tuesday or whatever it is. And God forbid anybody suggests that there are complicated people in this cybersecurity industry. You're obviously all rational professionals. But I mean, to really address, you mentioned before that I wanted to kind of, obnoxiously grab onto, and that is the elephant in the room of what is the fundamental problem. And especially when we're talking about SMEs, we have lack of resources, very often lack of capabilities and knowledge, increasing amounts of demands on them, but also increasing levels of threat, right? So how do we, granted that quantitative measurements, which is understandable in light of leadership and stakeholders wanting a clear, more objective, so what, just give me the numbers view of their cybersecurity ROI. But even given that, how do we, this is the $1 million question. How do we deal with that elephant in the room? Because no matter how we measure it, the threat landscape's not going away, right? And the requirements, the legislative, the regulatory, and the good practices and the customer requirements of these smaller firms are not going away. So what are I mean, any recommendations, any truth that you can speak from the ivory tower, from the mountain of academic wisdom? How do you see this?
So I think you bring up a really interesting point about how do we deal with it all, right? The threats, and the threats aren't going away. And one of the things, I don't have a solution for all of it, but one of the things that I think is really important to emphasize, quantitative does a really good job of measuring what we know. We know what these variables are. We're going to put together some sort of experiment and some sort of measurement scheme. We're going to operationalize our variables and we're going to measure it. But so one of the things about quantitative, it is confirmatory by nature. You're trying to confirm, you have a hypothesis and you're trying to confirm that hypothesis. What are the relationship between those variables? In terms of qualitative, it is much more exploratory. And that's where I think, integrating more qualitative research into cybersecurity would be really, really useful, because you're saying, how do we deal with it? These threats are always changing. And so one of the things is that we don't always know about these threats. And so quantitative, it's great at measuring what we already are looking for. But in terms of new things, it can be a little bit cumbersome to try to discover new threats in the way it comes. Now, qualitative is one of those, it's a type of research that kind of helps us see different threat landscapes, right? So if we're looking at a situation saying, these are all the different types of threats, if we understand these are the threats that's coming, why? What are they after? Why? And, we can start seeing patterns and to see, okay, well, these are the different ways. If they're liking these ones and these are how we've addressed it, these are still holes that are existing. And maybe these are different ways that we can kind of look at the landscape and see. So it offers a great way for exploratory. And I think one of the big things that I want to say is that it is not to replace quantitative. I think it is, both of these work best when they're complementing each other together, where they are not battling each other or in conflict. The research should work in tandem together. And it's not one or the other. It's how to both enrich each other. And you use it like triangulation. If one's saying this, one's saying this, how do we build those and, harmonize it, rather than saying one is better over the other, and so we should throw out one. So I think a lot of it, how do we deal with it? It's a combination of multiple different approaches. It is keeping a really open mind about what it is, and also just being very not getting too stuck in a certain mindset, and being willing to adapt and really look at the problem and not necessarily being married to a certain solution, if that makes sense. I know it's hard when we we invest in these certain things, but really just looking at the problem and moving from that point first, not theories or different things like that. Theory's great, but if it's not going to align and help you on the practice side, it doesn't it's not doing its job, at least in my opinion.
I could not agree more with you, and I really appreciate that approach of seeing it as various complementary sides of the same coin. I think, to an earlier point you made regarding your academic background, your PhD. No, I don't think that's atypical, and I have this very strong view that the information security industry as a whole benefits from having people from, for example, liberal arts backgrounds, from various different types of natural sciences. My background is international relations. I got into this because I was, screwing around with Unix boxes at school instead of actually doing my work. And I really think that this kind of multidisciplinary approach to not training people, but preparing people for something that requires the type of adaptability that allows them to look at things from different perspectives and incorporate, for example, non-formulaic, preconceptions of how to measure things, how to do things. I think that's an extremely positive, and ideal even. I wish we'd do more of it. I just realized that I miscalculated our meeting time remaining, or Zoom time. My apologies, but I wanted to touch quickly on some of your maybe we can talk a little bit about any plans that you've got for future work, any what's coming up for you. What are some of your objectives and research interests beyond this topic?
Yeah, so let's see. So right now, one of the things, I'm just closing down a study that looked at what are some of the regulatory challenges for small and medium-sized businesses in terms of cybersecurity. And so next year, I plan to start a related project which looks at organizational culture and how to, one of the things is there's every organization has a culture, but one of the things is how to align organizational culture around cybersecurity from large companies and to their smaller suppliers. And so that's a project where we're going to plan to do case studies of companies who have programs on organizational culture and different things like that. So that is something on the horizon for next year in terms of how can we help organizations better align and transmit their cybersecurity values and culture to different organizations in their supply chain.
That's actually really interesting because I think it's an often overlooked aspect of developing and growing a strong information security capability internally. If you're looking at it as part of the entire ecosystem, up and downstream, that's actually a really cool point. And I think we could probably spend an hour talking about this, of how especially large companies in a powerful market position, large consumers of services, can benefit the entire ecosystem by essentially pushing their level of capability and their cultural approach and maturity down to the wider environment and stakeholders and suppliers and vendors and whatever who may not have that level of readiness and strength. I think that's going to be a good one to keep an eye on, and one that's well in keeping with the times. Before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance. Is there anything else that you'd like to call out? Anything that you'd like to plug? Anything that you'd like to, share in terms of wisdom with our beloved viewers / listeners? I'll obviously link to Cam's. I'll link to your LinkedIn profile, any research you allow me to. But what is there out there that you want to share with internet land before we wrap up?
I would just like to say, well, first of all, thank you, and to thank you to CyAN for all of your help and just the different guidance and different opportunities that you guys have really helped to foster. Secondly, I think it would basically just be, cybersecurity is one of those things that I feel like it is a field full of really passionate individuals. And I know that sometimes that it can be so daunting, and that it is and sometimes demoralizing, honestly, right? Really, just because of all the different challenges and everything coming at it. But these are, what you're doing really does matter. And I that's what we study. And my research is it is only possible because of people who are so passionate and so willing to and open to talking about, these are what they're doing, what are things that really work, and having that really open dialogue that I just really appreciate. So I would always say thank you to everybody in the field. And, we're always open to talking and learning about, what are things going on in the field and different things and what is needed in the field. And so, my door is always open. I love these kinds of chats, and I learn from people. And that's how everything revolves around that. So thank you. And
that's a very positive observation. Thank you. I think, especially an industry that has a lot of tension, a lot of ego, a lot of challenges, it's often easy to forget that the main benefits come from talking to each other, exchanging views, exchanging expertise, and we all grow through that. So that said, I want to thank you very, very much for your time. I just want to quickly give a shout out also to visit our website, cybersecurityadvisors.network. I'll put all the links in again, the video and podcast description. If you have any questions about this series, about Jillian's work, about what CyAN does, about what CAMS does, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We also, of course, welcome any suggestions for topics. And with that, I wish you a pleasant and safe and hopefully warmer than it is here rest of the afternoon and week, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you so much.